Two bodies lay side by side on the grass, completely still, as if the world around them had simply moved on without noticing. No signs of struggle marked the ground, no scattered belongings. Nothing disturbed the moment they had been alive just minutes before. The bench behind them stood untouched, a quiet witness to something that should have been impossible to miss. Just meters away, people had passed through this park. Cars moved along the nearby road. Life continued without interruption. And yet, no one heard the moment everything ended. What began as a simple meeting between two friends ended in a silence no one could explain. A patrol car stops abruptly at the edge of the park. The call had been brief, unclear. 2 people down, no movement. Neither officer rushes out immediately. Both of them are watching, scanning the stillness ahead. There's no crowd, no panic, no sign that anything is wrong. But something feels off, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a place like this. Then, just beyond the trees, something on the ground begins to take shape. Both doors open at the same time. Neither of them speaks, but they're already moving faster than before. Their pace shifts the moment they step onto the grass. Controlled, but urgent, trained not to assume anything yet. From a distance, it looks unclear. Just shapes against the ground, nothing immediately recognizable. But as they get closer, the shapes don't move, not even slightly. And in that moment, both detectives understand this is no medical emergency. They stop just short of the bodies, not touching anything yet, letting their eyes take in every detail first. Both victims are positioned almost the same, side by side, facing forward as if they never saw anything coming. There are no defensive wounds, no signs of panic, nothing that suggests they had time to react. Richter's eyes move to the ground, then to the bench, then back again, mapping out what should have happened. But something doesn't add up. Not a single sign that anyone else was ever here. Weber steps closer first, careful with each step, avoiding anything that might disturb the scene. She lowers slightly, her attention fixed on their upper backs. Something small, but decisive catches her eye. No blood spread across the scene, no chaos. Just 2 precise points where everything ended. Richter doesn't need to ask. He already understands what she's seeing. Both of them, shot from behind, at close range, and neither one had the chance to turn around. Richter finally steps in, careful, deliberate, his eyes moving from one victim to the other, measuring distance, position, sequence. They weren't facing each other. They weren't arguing. They were sitting here, side by side, which means the shooter didn't approach from the front, didn't interrupt, didn't announce anything. Whoever did this walked up quietly, close enough, without raising a single alarm. And then, in a place filled with open space and daylight, they pulled the trigger, twice, and disappeared without a sound. Within minutes, the quiet park begins to change. Police tape stretches across the pathways as officers push people farther back from the scene. Most of the people nearby hadn't even realized anything had happened. Some had walked past the area less than 10 minutes earlier. A cyclist stops near the entrance, staring toward the bench, with the same question spreading through the crowd. How could 2 people be killed in broad daylight, without anyone hearing a thing?
Every truth we try to hide, every whisper grows a little louder in the silence of the night.
Crime scene technicians begin marking the area piece by piece, but almost immediately, something unusual stands out. There are no scattered shell casings nearby, no obvious trail, nothing left behind in panic. Whoever fired those shots either collected everything afterward or planned the attack carefully enough not to leave anything at all. Weber notices something else. Both victims still have their phones, wallets, keys. This wasn't robbery. Nothing about the scene suggests desperation. It feels targeted.
Every truth we try to hide, every whisper grows a little louder.
As investigators widen the search area, attention shifts toward the road, running alongside the park. Traffic had been moving steadily all afternoon, dozens of drivers passing within sight of the bench. Yet no emergency calls came in when the shots were fired. Not one driver reported hearing gunfire. Even more unsettling, a maintenance worker had been nearby the entire time. He saw Catherine and Carnell arrive at the park, but he never heard the moment they died. Lucas keeps replaying the afternoon in his head, trying to find something he missed. He remembers seeing them walk in together, calm, relaxed, like two friends meeting on an ordinary day. Nothing about their behavior suggested fear. Neither of them appeared to be waiting for trouble. Lucas had continued working only a short distance away, trimming overgrown grass near the pathway, and sometime between one routine moment and the next, two people were executed behind him without a sound.
Find a way back through the darkness when we turn off all the lights.
Investigators begin building a timeline almost immediately, starting with the victim's final known movements. Phone records show Catherine and Carnell had arranged to meet earlier that afternoon. Nothing unusual in the messages. No threats, no arguments, no sign either of them expected danger waiting at the park. But one detail keeps bothering investigators. The killer seemed to know exactly where they would be, because in a park this open, during a time this public, the attack only works if someone arrives prepared.
Every whisper grows a little louder in the silence of the night. Every memory we buried, every door we closed too tight, finds a way back through the dark.
By early evening, investigators stop treating the park like a random crime scene and start treating it like a planned execution. The shooter hadn't taken anything, hadn't spoken, and apparently hadn't stayed longer than a few seconds. That level of control changes the entire direction of the case. Now investigators aren't asking if the victims were targeted. They're asking which one of them was the real target. Because killing two people at once usually means one of them wasn't supposed to leave alive as a witness. The first deep background checks begin that night. Friends, family, relationships, routines, investigators start pulling apart both lives piece by piece. Catherine Brown is described the same way by almost everyone who knew her. Dependable, caring, careful about who she trusted. Carnell Sledge had a quieter reputation, private, reflective, someone who rarely shared personal problems openly. At first glance, neither life seems connected to violence serious enough to end like this. But the more details investigators collect, the more they begin noticing small gaps. Conversations left unfinished, relationships not fully explained. Investigators focus first on the most obvious possibility. Someone close to one of the victims. Former partners, strained friendships, unresolved arguments. Every personal connection is pulled into the investigation, but the early interviews create a frustrating pattern. Nobody remembers threats. Nobody describes recent fear. Nobody expected violence. The attack still feels personal, but there's no obvious person standing at the center of it, and that uncertainty forces investigators toward a more disturbing possibility. The killer may have planned this long before that afternoon. The next morning, investigators return to the park before sunrise, hoping the quiet might reveal something the chaos had hidden. Without the crowd, without the flashing lights, the location feels even more exposed than before. There were no hidden corners nearby, nowhere for someone to wait unnoticed for very long, which means the killer likely arrived shortly before the attack and left just as quickly. A short window, a precise moment, almost as if someone knew exactly when Catherine and Carnell would be sitting there. Investigators begin reconstructing the final minutes before the murders. Starting from the moment Catherine and Carnell entered the park, the two arrive separately, but only minutes apart. A meeting planned in advance and treated like routine. Security cameras from nearby roads capture vehicles entering and leaving the area, but nothing immediately stands out. No suspicious person appears following them into the park. No visible confrontation. No sign of panic before the attack, which leaves investigators facing the same impossible question again. How does someone carry out a double murder this cleanly, in the middle of the day, and vanish without a trace?
Every truth we try to hide, every whisper grows a little loud.
3 days into the investigation, detectives begin focusing less on the crime scene and more on the people connected to it. Every call, every recent message, every unexplained meeting starts getting pulled apart. One detail keeps resurfacing in interviews. Catherine and Carnell had become unusually private in the weeks before their deaths. Not fearful, not hiding, just quieter than usual, as if both of them were dealing with something they didn't fully discuss with others. And investigators begin wondering whether the answer to the case wasn't hidden in the park at all, but inside conversations nobody else had heard. Detectives begin retracing the victim's final communications hour by hour, searching for anything that breaks the pattern of an ordinary day. Most of the messages are simple, casual check-ins, normal plans between friends. But shortly before the meeting, both phones become unusually quiet. No outgoing calls, no new texts, almost as if both of them had already shifted their attention to someone else. And that possibility introduces a dangerous new question. Had someone arranged to meet them there too?
We buried, every door we close too tight finds a way back through the darkness when we turn off all
Investigators return to the possibility that the killer had blended into the park before the attack, unnoticed because they appeared completely ordinary. Reconstructed scene showing multiple ordinary park activities, while a distant figure quietly observes from another bench. Bright daylight, realistic public environment, cinematic tension. The theory explains one thing investigators couldn't ignore. The victims never reacted before they were shot. No sudden movement, no attempt to stand, no evidence they recognized danger behind them, which means the killer either earned their trust or mastered the kind of calm that hides deadly intent until the final second. As the investigation deepens, detectives begin separating the victims' lives into two different timelines. If the attack was personal, then one of those timelines should eventually lead toward conflict. But every lead seems to collapse halfway through. Arguments that went nowhere, suspicions without evidence, stories that don't fully connect. The case keeps creating tension without producing a face investigators can confidently place at the center of it. And that uncertainty slowly changes the atmosphere inside the investigation, because cases without clear motives rarely stay simple for long. By the end of the first week, pressure around the case begins to grow far beyond the investigation room. The idea that two people could be killed in a public park without witnesses unsettles the entire city. Tips begin flooding into the department. Unfamiliar vehicles, suspicious strangers, sounds people suddenly think they remember hearing. Most of the information leads nowhere. But detectives know public fear can still reveal overlooked details. Because somewhere inside all the noise, investigators believe someone already knows exactly what happened on that bench.
They follow where you go. Every secret that you keep is a truth you never show. In the dark they speak in a voice you know.
8 days after the murders, investigators receive the first tip that genuinely changes the direction of the case. A caller claims they saw someone near the bench shortly before the attack. Someone standing still for too long. Not jogging, not walking a dog, not using the park like everyone else around them. The witness can't provide a clear face, only a memory that something about the person felt wrong afterward. And for the first time since the bodies were discovered, investigators begin considering that the killer may have stayed at the scene long enough to watch the victims before striking. The witness returns with detectives to the park the following morning, trying to remember exactly where the stranger had been standing. At first, everything looks different in daylight after the chaos of the investigation week. Then the witness stops near a cluster of trees overlooking the bench. From there, the person would have been able to watch Catherine and Carnell without drawing much attention, and suddenly, the murders stop looking impulsive and start feeling like surveillance. Investigators begin reviewing the timeline again, this time searching for anyone who could have known the victims would be at that bench. The list is smaller than expected. Only a handful of people knew about the meeting beforehand. That realization changes the case immediately, because random violence no longer fits the evidence. Whoever approached that bench likely knew exactly who would be sitting there, and exactly when, which means the killer may not have been searching for victims that afternoon. They may have been waiting specifically for them. Late that night, Richter sits alone reviewing the case from the beginning again, searching for the mistake the killer thought nobody would notice. The precision of the attack keeps bothering him. 2 shots, 2 deaths, no panic, no witnesses. It feels less like sudden violence, and more like someone rehearsed the moment in their head long before it happened. Then Richter notices something buried inside the timeline. The meeting itself had been arranged unusually quickly, not days in advance, not carefully planned between friends. Almost as if the decision to meet happened shortly before they arrived at the park. That detail forces investigators into a new theory. The killer may not have planned the meeting itself. Instead, they may have learned about it quickly and acted just as fast. That possibility narrows the field dramatically, because it points towards someone already connected to one of the victims, someone close enough to hear about the meeting, but controlled enough to hide every trace afterward. And for the first time since the murders, the investigation stops feeling directionless, because somewhere inside the victims' personal lives, investigators believe the killer is finally starting to take shape.
They never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never dared to say. Every moment we were falling still comes back to us one day. There's a feeling in the distance, like a storm about to rise. You can see it.
2 weeks into the case, investigators quietly shift their focus toward people closest to Catherine and Carnell. Not because they have proof yet, but because the murders no longer feel random in any way. The killer knew the location, the timing, and how to approach without triggering fear. That kind of confidence usually comes from familiarity, not chance. And as detectives dig deeper into the victims' private lives, one relationship begins drawing more attention than the others. The relationship wasn't openly hostile, at least not from the outside. But investigators begin hearing the same phrase repeated in different interviews. There had been tension lately. Nobody describes screaming arguments, no dramatic threats, just a quiet strain that had started building beneath normal conversations. The kind of tension people often ignore, until something forces them to look back differently. And suddenly, investigators aren't just asking who could commit murder in broad daylight. They're asking who had emotional reasons to want one of the victims silenced. Detectives begin re-examining Catherine's final days in greater detail, focusing on subtle changes people barely noticed at the time. One friend remembers Catherine seeming distracted during a recent conversation, checking her phone more than usual. Another remembers her cancelling plans unexpectedly just days before the murders. None of it seemed alarming on its own, but together, the behavior suggests pressure Catherine may not have shared openly. And investigators begin wondering whether the meeting at the park wasn't casual at all, but connected to something Catherine had been trying to handle privately. While Weber focuses on Catherine's timeline, Richter turns his attention toward Carnell's recent behavior. Friends describe him as unusually guarded during the weeks before the murders, more withdrawn than normal, not frightened, not paranoid, just carrying the kind of mental weight people struggle to explain. Then investigators uncover something else. Carnell had recently spoken to several people about needing to resolve an issue soon, but nobody can clearly explain what that issue actually was, or whether the meeting at the park was supposed to settle it. As both timelines begin overlapping, investigators notice a dangerous possibility emerging between them. What if the meeting wasn't social at all? What if both of them arrived expecting a serious conversation? A conversation someone else may have discovered, overheard, or feared. The theory changes the emotional center of the case completely, because now investigators are no longer looking at random victims. They may be looking at two people who walked into the park carrying information someone was desperate to control.
Sleep, they never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never dared to say. Every moment we were falling.
The investigation turns sharply once detectives uncover a detail hidden inside the victim's phone activity. In the hours before the murders, both Catherine and Carnell had received calls from the same unknown number. The calls were short, less than a minute each, but they happened shortly before the meeting was arranged. Detectives immediately try tracing the number, but the result only deepens the mystery. The phone had been prepaid, activated briefly, then disconnected completely after the murders. The prepaid phone changes the investigation immediately, because now the murders appear even more deliberate than before. Someone had gone through the effort of hiding communication before the attack even happened. That level of preparation suggests planning, patience, and a strong reason not to be connected to the victims publicly. Detectives begin asking whether the unknown caller convinced Catherine and Carnell to meet that afternoon, or simply confirmed they already would. Either way, the person behind that phone knew exactly where the victims would end up before the murders occurred. Investigators request tower data next, hoping the prepaid phone left behind a digital shadow before disappearing. The results place the phone near the park shortly before the murders, then moving away minutes later. The movement pattern is calm, direct, not the behavior of someone fleeing in panic. Whoever carried that phone believed they had already avoided attention, but even careful planning leaves fragments behind, and investigators finally have proof the killer was physically near the park that afternoon. With the phone now tied to the area, detectives begin searching for surveillance footage far beyond the park itself. Gas stations, intersections, parking lots, any camera that might have captured vehicles entering or leaving around the time of the murders. Hours of footage reveal ordinary traffic. At first, commuters, delivery vans, cyclists, families moving through the afternoon normally. Then one vehicle begins appearing repeatedly near the relevant time window. Not enough to identify the driver yet, but enough to stand out. The car enters the area shortly before Catherine and Carnell arrive, and leaves minutes after investigators believe the murders happened. Detectives isolate every frame they can find of the vehicle, trying to pull clarity out of blurred pixels and reflections. The license plate remains unreadable, but the vehicle itself becomes more recognizable with each angle. A dark sedan, older model, minor damage near the rear bumper. It's the first physical object investigators can realistically search for, and the first clue that feels tangible. Because after weeks of silence, the killer may have finally left something behind that can be followed.
They never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never dared to say. Every moment we were falling still comes back to us.
The damaged sedan quickly becomes the center of the investigation, because it's finally something detectives can trace into the real world. Traffic cameras from neighboring streets are reviewed again, this time focusing only on vehicles matching the same model and damage pattern. The search slowly narrows from hundreds of vehicles to dozens, then finally to only a few realistic matches. One registration immediately draws attention, not because of the owner's criminal history, but because of a possible connection to one of the victims. For the first time in the case, a name begins moving quietly toward the center of the investigation. Detectives avoid moving too quickly, because a weak assumption could destroy the strongest lead they've had so far. Instead, they begin rebuilding the person's recent movements, hour by hour. The vehicle had been near the park at the exact right time, but proximity alone isn't enough to prove murder. Then another detail surfaces. The registered owner had unexpectedly changed routine shortly after the killings. Missed work shifts, sudden distance from familiar people, and behavior that felt less like grief and more like avoidance. Investigators quietly begin surveillance, careful not to alert the person they're now watching closely. For several days, the routine appears almost painfully ordinary. No sudden escapes, no destroyed evidence, no obvious signs of panic. But Richter notices something difficult to ignore. The person never returns to the park area after the murders, almost as if they understood that one visit back could expose everything. Then the investigation takes another turn. Detectives uncover a connection they hadn't fully understood before. The person tied to the vehicle hadn't just known one victim. They had indirect access to both Catherine and Carnell, not close enough to attract attention publicly, but close enough to hear conversations, notice changes, and learn about private meetings. Suddenly, the murders begin looking less like a spontaneous act of violence and more like an emotional reaction that had been building quietly over time. And investigators start considering the possibility that the killer didn't go to the park planning to eliminate two people, only one. That theory forces detectives to reconstruct the murders one more time, now with a completely different emotional motive behind them. The killer arrives already focused on one person, carrying anger, betrayal, or resentment that had been building privately. But when the moment finally comes, Carnell's presence changes everything. A witness left alive could identify the attacker, explain the confrontation, expose the motive. And in that version of events, the second murder wasn't part of the original plan. It became necessary the moment the killer realized they hadn't found Catherine alone.
Sleep, they never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never dared to say. Every moment we were falling still.
With the reconstructed motive becoming clearer, detectives finally decide to confront the person connected to the vehicle directly. They don't arrive with enough evidence for an arrest, only enough pressure to watch reactions carefully. The door opens slowly, and the person standing there looks more exhausted than surprised. Richter immediately notices something unusual. The person already seems prepared for questions about the park. And before detectives even mention Catherine or Carnell by name, the atmosphere inside the apartment changes completely. The conversation begins calmly, almost carefully, as if everyone inside the room understands how important every word has become. The suspect admits knowing Catherine, then quietly confirms knowing Carnell too. But when detectives ask about the afternoon of the murders, the answers begin arriving too quickly. Specific times, exact movements, details most innocent people struggle to remember under pressure. And the more the suspect explains, the more detectives begin feeling like they're listening to someone who rehearsed the story beforehand. The room falls silent the moment the surveillance images touch the table. The suspect stares at the images longer than expected, not shocked they exist, shocked investigators found them. Richter says nothing at first, letting the silence force its own pressure into the conversation. Then quietly, the suspect changes the story. Now the suspect admits driving near the park that afternoon, but claims it was only coincidence, nothing more. The explanation sounds possible at first, but only until detectives compare it against the timeline again. The suspect's version of events leaves too many perfectly timed coincidences. Near the park at the exact time of the murders, connected indirectly to both victims, tied to a disposable phone used hours before the attack. Individually, none of it proves murder. Together, it begins forming something much heavier. And for the first time since Catherine Brown and Carnell's sledge were found beside that bench, investigators believe they are no longer searching for a mystery. They are building a case against a killer. The explanation sounds possible at first, but only until detectives compare it against the timeline again. The suspect's version of events leaves too many perfectly timed coincidences. Near the park at the exact time of the murders, connected indirectly to both victims, tied to a disposable phone used hours before the attack. Individually, none of it proves murder. Together, it begins forming something much heavier. And for the first time since Catherine Brown and Carnell Sledge were found beside that bench, investigators believe they are no longer searching for a mystery. They are building a case against a killer.
Sleep, they never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never dared to say. Every moment we were falling still.
Even with the growing evidence, prosecutors still warn detectives about one major problem. The entire case is still circumstantial. No murder weapon. No eyewitness placing the suspect directly behind the bench. No confession. What investigators have instead is behavior, preparation, timing, and a trail of decisions that keep circling back to the same person. Richter knows cases like this can collapse if detectives move too early. So instead of forcing an arrest, investigators decide to keep building pressure quietly, waiting for the suspect to make a mistake. The pressure begins affecting the suspect almost immediately, even without another interview. Friends notice missed calls, going unanswered, messages ignored, sudden isolation, replacing normal routines. The suspect begins avoiding familiar places, changing driving routes, watching constantly for signs of surveillance. To detectives, the behavior doesn't feel like grief or fear. It feels like someone struggling to stay ahead of consequences. And the more the suspect pulls away from ordinary life, the more investigators become convinced the emotional motive behind the murders was real. Then investigators receive another break. This one far more dangerous for the suspect than the vehicle footage. A witness comes forward, claiming the suspect had spoken emotionally about one of the victims shortly before the murders. Not direct threats, nothing explicit enough to alarm people at the time, but enough to reveal growing resentment. The witness remembers one phrase clearly. They think they can keep lying forever, and suddenly, investigators believe the murders may have been triggered not by money or revenge alone, but by a personal truth the suspect believed was being hidden. Detectives begin reconstructing the emotional timeline behind the murders, not just the physical one. The pattern now suggests months of quiet resentment building beneath ordinary interactions. Small arguments, avoided conversations, emotional reactions, people dismissed as temporary stress. But to investigators, the behavior now looks less temporary and more like escalation, slowly moving toward violence. And in the middle of that emotional spiral, Catherine and Carnell arranged a private meeting in a public park. By the end of the second month, detectives believe they finally understand the most likely sequence of events inside the park. The suspect learns about the meeting shortly before it happens, possibly through a call, possibly through someone close to the victims. Anger that had been building privately for weeks finally turns into action. The suspect watches Catherine and Carnell from a distance first, waits for the right moment, then approaches from behind without warning. And in less than a few seconds, 2 lives end beside a public park bench, while traffic continues moving nearby, and nobody realizes a double murder has just happened.
Sleep, they never let you go.
Even after reconstructing the murders step by step, detectives still face the hardest part of the case, turning belief into proof, because the suspect has become more careful with every passing week. Fewer phone calls, shorter conversations, long stretches of silence replacing normal behavior. To Weber, the behavior feels less like innocence and more like someone mentally preparing for consequences. And investigators know time is becoming dangerous, because the longer the case remains unresolved, the greater the chance critical evidence disappears forever. Investigators decide the next move carefully. They need pressure strong enough to provoke a mistake, but subtle enough not to trigger disappearance. So instead of another direct confrontation, they begin tightening surveillance around the suspect's daily routine. Every drive, Every stop, every unexpected movement starts getting documented. Then one evening, the suspect suddenly changes direction without explanation. And for the first time since the murders, investigators believe the suspect may be heading towards something connected to the crime itself. The sedan leaves the city gradually, moving toward quieter roads with fewer cameras and less traffic. Richter keeps distance between the vehicles, careful not to risk losing the suspect by getting too close. After nearly 40 minutes, the suspect finally turns onto a narrow road leading toward an abandoned industrial area. The location immediately unsettles investigators because nobody drives this far without purpose. And when the suspect finally steps out of the car carrying something wrapped in dark fabric, the entire investigation changes. Neither detective moves immediately, both watching from a distance as the suspect disappears between the abandoned structures. The area is silent, except for distant metal creaking in the wind. Richter quietly radios for backup, but he already knows they may finally be standing near the evidence missing since the murders. Minutes pass. Then the suspect reappears, no longer carrying the wrapped object. And in that moment, investigators stop wondering whether the suspect is connected to the murders. Now they need to know what was just hidden. The suspect drives away minutes later. Unaware investigators are now treating the industrial site like a hidden crime scene. Backup units arrive quietly after midnight. Headlights cut low to avoid attention from nearby roads. Investigators begin searching the structures one building at a time, following the exact path the suspect had taken earlier. Then, inside a collapsed storage area beneath broken concrete and debris, they find it. A handgun, carefully concealed, matching the caliber investigators had been searching for since the day Catherine Brown and Carnell Sledge were killed.
Sleep, they never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never
The
dared to
weapon
say.
is transported to the lab before sunrise, guarded more carefully than anything investigators have recovered in the entire case. Because if the handgun matches the bullets recovered from the victims, the investigation changes permanently. For the first time since the murders, detectives may finally have physical evidence tying the suspect directly to the crime. Hours pass, while ballistic comparisons begin, every microscopic marking examined one by one. Then shortly after midday, Richter receives the call he has been waiting months to hear. The ballistic match is confirmed. The recovered handgun fired the shots that killed Catherine Brown and Carnell Sledge. Months of uncertainty collapse into a single, undeniable connection. The suspect had returned to hide the weapon, believing distance and time would protect them from discovery. Instead, that decision becomes the mistake that finally breaks the case open. And by evening, investigators begin preparing the arrest warrant connected to the murders at the park bench. The arrest operation begins before dawn, timed carefully to prevent the suspect from disappearing again. Richter watches the apartment windows from across the street, replaying every step that brought the investigation here. The park, the prepaid phone, the surveillance footage, the hidden gun. Every piece alone had been incomplete. Together, they formed the truth. Then at exactly 5:12 a.m., the order is given to move in. The apartment door opens after only seconds, almost as if the suspect had been expecting this moment for a long time. There's no attempt to run, no argument, no shock, only the quiet expression of someone realizing the investigation finally reached the truth. As officers secure the apartment, Weber notices photographs of Catherine still sitting openly inside the living room. And suddenly the case stops feeling like a distant mystery. It becomes painfully personal. During the formal interview that follows, the suspect continues denying the murders. But this time, the evidence no longer leaves room to hide behind coincidence. The vehicle, the phone, the weapon hidden at the industrial site. Every path leads back to the same person. And when detectives present the ballistic match, the suspect finally stops answering questions altogether. After months of silence, contradictions, and hidden anger, and the truth surrounding the park bench murders finally closes in, around the person investigators believe pulled the trigger that afternoon.
Sleep, they never let you go.
News of the arrest spreads across the city before noon, ending months of fear surrounding the park bench murders. For many people, the case had stopped feeling like a crime story long ago. It had become a warning. 2 people killed in broad daylight, beside a public walking path, while ordinary life continued only meters away. Now investigators finally believe they understand what happened that afternoon, and why nobody recognized the danger until it was too late. Because the killer didn't arrive looking dangerous. They arrived looking familiar. As prosecutors prepare the case for court, detectives continue rebuilding the emotional chain that led to the murders. The motive no longer appears impulsive. It looks personal, layered, and quietly growing over time. Investigators believe the suspect became consumed by the idea that important truths were being hidden from them. And when Catherine arranged the private meeting with Carnell, the suspect interpreted it as confirmation of betrayal. That emotional spiral eventually carried the suspect into the park. Armed, angry, and convinced confrontation would finally bring answers. Investigators believe the confrontation lasted only seconds, far shorter than anyone originally imagined. The suspect approaches from behind, lightly speaking, only briefly before the violence begins. There's no evidence of a fight, no indication either victim had time to escape, which means the victims probably recognized the suspect only moments before the shots were fired, and by the time fear finally reached them, it was already too late. After the murders, investigators believe the suspect walked away from the bench almost immediately. No running, no panic, just controlled movement through a park where nobody realized what had happened yet. That calm escape becomes one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case, because it suggests the suspect believed the murders had solved the problem completely. But hidden anger rarely disappears after violence. It leaves traces behind, in behavior, in decisions, and eventually, in evidence. For Catherine and Carnell's families, the arrest brings relief, but not peace. The investigation answered who investigators believed committed the murders, but it could never fully explain why 2 lives ended beside that bench. A private emotional conflict had crossed silently into public violence, without warning to anyone nearby. And in the end, the biggest mystery wasn't how the suspect escaped unnoticed. It was how quickly ordinary trust, ordinary conversation, and ordinary silence transformed into murder in the middle of a public park.
Never sleep, they never let you go.
Months after the arrest, prosecutors begin presenting the reconstructed timeline publicly for the first time. Every piece of the investigation is laid out carefully, not as a mystery anymore, but as a sequence of deliberate choices. The prosecution argues the murders were driven by emotional fixation, growing resentment, and the belief that Catherine and Carnell were hiding something important. For the families listening inside the courtroom, hearing the final reconstruction feels almost unbearable, because every detail brings them back to the same horrifying truth. Catherine and Carnell never realized danger had already entered the park with them. The courtroom grows silent when prosecutors present the ballistic evidence recovered from the abandoned industrial site. For months, the weapon had remained hidden beneath broken concrete and rusted debris, waiting for one mistake to expose it. The prosecution explains how investigators followed the suspect there through surveillance, patience, and behavioral analysis. What once looked like disconnected clues now forms a single, uninterrupted chain. And sitting only a few meters away, the suspect listens silently as the hidden truth behind the park bench murders is rebuilt piece by piece. Then prosecutors reveal the emotional motive investigators believe pushed the suspect toward violence. Not financial gain, not robbery, not random rage. Investigators believe the murders came from emotional obsession, fear of betrayal, and resentment that had quietly grown out of control. The prosecution argues the suspect convinced themselves the meeting at the park confirmed every fear they had been carrying for weeks. And once the suspect reached that conclusion, The quiet afternoon inside the park became the final stage of a private emotional collapse. Defense attorneys challenged the reconstruction immediately, arguing that emotion and coincidence are not the same as certainty. They point to the lack of eyewitnesses, the absence of direct video, and the fact that nobody saw the actual shooting happen. For a moment, the uncertainty that haunted the case from the beginning seems to return. Then prosecutors return to the evidence hidden at the industrial site, the one piece the defense cannot easily explain away. Because regardless of motive, regardless of interpretation, the suspect led investigators directly to the murder weapon. By the final days of testimony, the courtroom no longer feels focused on mystery. It feels focused on accountability. The prosecution rebuilds the final timeline one last time, from the phone call, to the park, to the hidden weapon. Not as speculation anymore, but as a chain of decisions that left physical evidence behind at every stage. For Catherine and Carnell's families, hearing the reconstruction repeated aloud forces them to relive the worst day of their lives again. But this time, the silence surrounding the park bench murders is finally breaking in public.
Ghosts never sleep, they never let you go. Broken stories on the ceiling, names we never dared to say.
Long after the courtroom empties, the park remains exactly where it has always been. People still jog past the walking trails. Families still sit near the water. Traffic still moves beyond the trees. Nothing about the location warns strangers what happened there on that summer afternoon. And maybe that became the most unsettling part of the entire case. Because the danger never arrived looking violent. It arrived looking familiar, trusted, and completely ordinary. Investigators eventually closed the official case files, but some questions never fully disappear. Would the murders have happened if the suspect had never learned about the meeting? Would Catherine and Carnell still be alive if the conversation happened somewhere else? Those answers disappeared the moment the gunshots echoed through the park unnoticed. But the investigation uncovered something equally important. Violence doesn't always begin with chaos. Sometimes it begins quietly, inside private thoughts no one else can hear, until one ordinary afternoon suddenly turns fatal. Years later, people still remember the case, not because of how violent it was, but because of how impossible it first seemed. 2 people killed in broad daylight. No screams, no witnesses, no immediate explanation. At first, the silence surrounding the murders felt almost unnatural, but eventually investigators realized the silence itself was part of the answer. The killer escaped attention because nobody nearby saw a stranger. They saw someone who looked like they belonged there. In the final reconstruction of the case, investigators believe the murders were never about the park itself. The park was only the stage where months of emotional instability finally became irreversible violence. A hidden phone call, a rushed meeting, a familiar face arriving with private anger no one else could see, and within seconds, 2 ordinary lives disappeared in the middle of a public afternoon. What remained afterward wasn't just grief. It was the terrifying realization that violence can sometimes arrive without chaos, without warning, and without anyone recognizing it until everything is already over. Catherine Brown and Carnell Sledge left home expecting an ordinary afternoon. Neither of them knew that somewhere nearby, someone had already decided the meeting would end differently. What investigators eventually uncovered was not a random act of violence, but a private emotional collapse that followed them into a public space. And although the investigation finally revealed the truth behind the murders, the silence surrounding that bench still lingers long after the case ended. Because on June 4th, 2019, in the middle of an ordinary public afternoon, 2 lives ended in silence, while the rest of the world kept moving around them.
Turns into a quiet whisper in the corners of our sleep. There's no ending to the story, only chapters left behind. And the truth is always waiting in the shadows of the mind. Final calling, soft fade. Echoes never shadows never sleep. In the silence they remain. In the silence.